Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and here I am at the last house of Sigmund Freud. And indeed Sigmund Freud died in this house. So Freud was born in Austria in 1856 into a Jewish family. His father was a successful businessman, factory owner, and Sigmund was one of several children. Anyway, so he was very academically gifted, and he decided he wanted to study medicine. He was brought up in a liberal Jewish family, so he went to the University of Vienna. He qualified as a doctor, but he specialized in psychiatry, and he thought there was quite obviously a link between the state of mind, the physical state, and that really became the focus of his studies. Eventually became Professor Extraordinarius. I don't know how that's different from an ordinary professor, but he was mostly in private practice. And he was fascinated by dreams. These things have got to come from somewhere. Started all sorts of psychotherapy, talking cures for various psychiatric and indeed psychological problems. Obviously, there's a frontier between the two. They cross over. So he broke a lot of taboos, and he, for example, said, well, this is what every nursemaid knows, that infants masturbate. They've discovered their genitals as they touch them for stimulation. But obviously then you're told that that's dirty, you mustn't do that, and the sexuality kind of goes underground for several years, and coming back out at adolescence, when they've been socialized into this culture of shame. But he said that homosexual desires were much more common than were usually recognized, and he was against repression, talking through problems, and that was the way to purge yourself of it, not burying it. So this is maybe the start of this confessional culture, letting it all hang out. Pioneered the idea of people lying down on a sofa facing away from the psychiatrist and talking about their problems. And he was fascinated by religion, even though he was a convinced atheist, and said that, calling God Father, well, that's because it really is like an infantile vision of a father, assuming him to be almighty and all-knowing and things like that, omniscient. So he had lots of little idols collected from religions from around the world, and I felt they're quite useful. They told us something about the unconscious, something that was quite universal, our desires, our fears, and so forth. So he married, he had several children himself. So he thought, as I say, that religion was bunkum, but there was a lot to learn from it. So that's why he wrote Moses and Monotheism about it, particularly, say, Judaism, to a less extent Christianity and Islam, because of course he was living in Austria, a 90% Christian country, mostly Catholics, those Christians too, where there's rich tradition of iconography, which Judaism eschews because that's close to idolatry. Anyway, he didn't really care for politics very much. This is a time of great upheaval. Obviously, German was his first language. He was there during the First World War. Movements like socialism, actually communism, came to the fore at this time, but he had no truck with those. There was a large and influential Viennese Jewish community at the time. Anyway, so he became very well known by the 1920s, invited to lecture abroad, and he's the father of psychoanalysis, and that became quite de rigueur in psychiatric circles. And one of his disciples was a Swiss Dr. Carl Gustav Jung, but Jung somewhat disagreed with him. They clashed a little bit in time. Anyway, so I'm not a doctor, so I can only scratch the surface of what he was about, just having read these real beginner's guides to Freud. Talked about the Oedipus complex, that most men desire their mother, and somehow some sort of Oedipal moment, things like that. These Greek myths tell us something about trying to cope with guilt and shame, about Oedipus blinding himself when he discovers that actually that Jocasta is his mother, things like that. So that these myths, that they serve some sort of purpose for the tribe, and that in ways we still are that beast unbound. We haven't really evolved that much despite this veneer of civilization. His publications were highly contentious. The National Socialists in Germany detested what he had to say, thought it was attacking the family, and this was some sort of a Jewish conspiracy against them, that it was all filth. 1938, that March, Austria united with Germany. That's Anschluss, as in connection in Germany. Connection in German. So anti-Semitic policies were going to be introduced into Austria. So it's not safe for him to stay there anymore. So he emigrated to the United Kingdom, settling here in London in this house, where he was well known and had many admirers amongst the medical profession. He still had some enemies in the medical establishment because what he said was so contentious. But he was retired by that stage, and he was always smoking a pipe, but he had throat cancer by the end. So he moved here, and when they've been burning his books in Germany a few years earlier, he quipped, 100 years ago they would have been burning me, this is progress. Well, Heinrich Heine, the German Jewish poet, had said in the early 19th century, where first you burn books, later you burn people, and unfortunately that proved to be prescient. So he died here just after the Second World War broke out in 1939. And I'm not sure, I have a feeling he was cremated at Golders Green Cemetery, Golders Green Crematorium, and maybe his ashes are there. That's where there's a big Jewish graveyard across the road from the crematorium where Amy Winehouse smoked her last. And so his daughter Anna Freud, she continued his work, particularly in child psychoanalysis. And he had Lucian Freud, his grandson, very well-known painter, and then another one of his grandsons, Clement Freud, the Liberal Member of Parliament and the advertising mogul. He was well known for this advert where there's a joke about Clement Freud and his dog looking like one another to promote their particular dog food. He's the MP for the Isle of Ely. And then is it Bella Freud? Is she his granddaughter or great-granddaughter? A well-known fashion designer, but critic of Israel. Anyway, that's just a little bit about Sigmund Freud. So follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, and book online lessons with me in everything except psychoanalysis, humanities subjects, French and law, and I'll be your tour guide in London. I help people with theses, dissertations, personal statements, essays, interview practice, and I translate from French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, German and Russian. That's about everything. Okay, toodaloo.